So they actually, still within that drought, were able to get enough to eat. In spite of the fact that the maize fails. Of course, stockpiles and surplus, which now the communities are able to do because of the increased yields. Weather index insurance is something that we're working on. Climate forecasts so that people can actually prepare ahead of time for these disasters, and preparedness for emergency relief. I won't discuss, of course, a major effort. One of the main components of the Millennium Villages is to make absolutely sure that every family is within a short walking distance of a water point, whether it be a borehole or a protected spring. And you all know and have discussed here and in other how incredibly transformative access to water is, because women really spend hours and hours, and it is mainly women, and often their children who should be at school getting water. And of course, the whole discussion about safe water is critical. I just want to discuss briefly what we do in the Millennium Villages in terms of diseases. And of course, water problems is one of the main source of diseases in terms of diarrhea and some of the soil-transmitted helminth and schistosomiasis. So as everything in health, it divides into three areas. One is prevention. The other is treatment, prophylactic treatment, and the third one is actually curative treatment. In terms of prevention for diseases having to do with water scarcity, it's of course all the things that we've discussed before, which is infrastructure, toilets, sewage, education, sanitation and hygiene programs like the personal hygiene and sanitation education program that GlaxoSmithKline does, etc. Prophylactic treatment is incredibly important and actually very easily done. So all of the Millennium Villages, because most of them do have soil-transmitted helminth and worm burden, we do the community itself organizes itself to do a community-based deworming. And it's extremely effective. It's one pill once or twice a year. It makes a huge difference in terms of children's growth and cognitive development. And then in terms of curative, if by chance the child really does have, in spite of the prevention and in spite of the treatment prophylaxis, if they do come down with diarrhea to the point of dehydration, then of course what's critical is that we're helping these communities set up a health system, which I'll be glad to discuss with those of you who are interested. But the health system that we've set up, which is one I'm in charge of, is basically filling out the last mile. As you all know, in sub-Saharan Africa, most of the health system, if there is one, it sort of ends at the sub-district level. And so what we're working on within a very controlled costing space is to basically make sure that each villager has access to a clinic, that the clinic is free, that there is a community health worker, that there's transportation, telephony, and a referral hospital to treat illnesses. So just to summarize the three things that I'm learning from our Millennium Villages project is, well, first of all, or the last point being that I really am becoming even more a believer in this integrated rural development. I'm using the word Millennium Villages just as a shorthand, but the idea being that in fact, and I think it's starting to be accepted because other organizations are starting to do similar things, like Clinton and Gates Foundation, which is not just health or just agriculture, but that you really need to pay attention to all the different components: health, agriculture, in other words, increased food production, infrastructure, and business development. I'm a very strong advocate of that approach, and our surveys are quite encouraging to show positive results. And in terms of policy recommendations, there are these three funds that, of course, are well-known and controversial financing mechanisms. The Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria has actually, although woefully underfunded, has actually made a huge difference with patients who have AIDS, TB, or malaria. But it should be, as you all know, there's a big movement to try to actually have another window of funding for health systems. So in other words, that countries should be able to make specific plans that actually have to do with building a health system rather than just the vertical disease funds. And similarly, there should be a water and sanitation fund. And an agriculture fund, by the way, is about to be announced, I think, in just a couple of days by the World Bank, and that's actually a major encouraging step forward. The only problem is that at the G20, the last one, the promise was $20 billion, and in fact, for the moment, only $1 billion. It was supposed to be $20 billion for 3 years. For the moment, it's $1 billion. $1 billion between the U.S., Spain, and Canada, I believe. But I think these three multi-sectoral financing mechanisms will really make a difference, just like the Global Fund has made quite a difference to the AIDS, TB, and malaria problem in sub-Saharan Africa. So if there are any, I mean, there's tons more that I would love to tell you about the Millennium Villages project, but I wanted to just focus on the water and mainly use the example of Corraro because it's the one place where I have seen the community absolutely take grasp of their incredibly degraded landscape, and by knowing that there were other partners like the World Food Program, like the Millennium Village Project, like the government that has agreed to step in if the other partners stepped in, under those circumstances, the community itself has absolutely risen to remolding what I would have thought would be an area that should basically be abandoned. So I just think that the Ethiopian scenario is a very interesting learning that even very dry areas can be rehabilitated. If there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer, and if not, of course, I can answer afterwards.
Yes, first I would just like to thank you very much, Sonia. Sonia has just gotten back from Malawi and East Timor, and so I'm sure she could shed light on those two areas too, if you would like. But thank you very much personally also for going into a lot of areas, just like you said, that other persons might just say this is, people should really leave these areas, but in fact it's their home, and that you've made a significant difference there for them, profoundly different. So I would just like to ask, are there any questions or comments that people would have? This lady back here, please.
Hi, I really appreciated your presentation, and I was wondering if you might speak now on your recent visit about the kind of activities that the women are now doing now that 6 hours of their day are no longer spent with the water, whether they were involved in sort of the empowerment of the project or whether they're involved in other activities in the community.
Actually, you're asking one of the things that I feel incredibly strongly about because when we've approached donors, you know, all of this effort is basically, for the time being, privately funded, although by some of it by governments also. A lot of people have said to us no, because we actually only want to fund organizations that have a human rights and a gender sort of a gender agenda. And I always found that sort of very wrong-headed because I have learned through working now very intimately. I go to these 14 sites in 10 countries all the time, and I have learned from the focus groups and then just watching the communities work, I have learned that it's not by going to a community and saying, I will give you such and such, if and only if you make sure that you put women in charge of these committees, or if you make sure that you don't discriminate against women. I have found that by helping these communities, and all the work is done only by local people, no expats, none of us are, of course, doing any other work. I have found that by helping the community have access to food, in other words, have the farms being much more productive, have water be nearby, have a clinic that they can walk to at most within 2 hours, to make sure that the clinic has a doctor, that the women can deliver safely with a skilled birth attendant, and that there are business opportunities. It's when you make the life for the women, because of course the women are the beasts of burden. If you make life easier for them by making their daily tasks easier, then it happens spontaneously. So policy makers, because we all know that scientists can have wonderful facts and know a lot of things in their field, but they really don't have a way of making it translate into any policies. And policymakers have their fingers on the, or have their hands on the levers